Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Fanfiction podcast. I'm so excited to have you here. Today, we're diving into a brand new story, The Last of His Kind Part 3. Before we jump in, don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and drop your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear what you think. Chapter 7. So hey all, here is the next chapter to The Last of His Kind. Again, the response so far has been brilliant, so thanks for that, and after reading the reviews for the last chapter 1, have made some minor changes to Azoth's stat sheet. I've also renamed the name of the manor. After all, it turns out Hearthfire is the name of the Hestia Familiar's future home in canon. I didn't realize that, as I instead chose the name based off of the Elder Scrolls Hearthfire expansion. Hope you all enjoy this chapter. I have to say I am really enjoying writing this story at the moment. In part 1, think it was because the second season of the Danmachi anime was running. Though unfortunately the season is over now, but some good news at that a third season has apparently been confirmed for next year, so that should be good. Still though, despite that, I am liking this story at the moment, and am really appreciative that so many others are enjoying it too. Thanks a lot for reading, and I hope you continue to enjoy reading, and leave a review. If you have any questions, please feel free to PM me. Disclaimer: I do not own the Elder Scrolls or Danmachi. Last time, with such a powerful person now in her familiar, she knew she would need to be careful in how she approached things. She didn't want to alienate the other members by just giving him the perks his level and skills deserved, despite him having just joined. At the same time, though, she didn't want to disadvantage Azoth by not giving him these perks. No, she wanted to help him grow, and to achieve his goal. It was complicated, and thinking on it now, she knew it wasn't something that she felt she could deal with on her own. I'll ask her about it, Hephaestus thought to herself, folding the sheet with Azoth's status on it up as she did so and sticking it in the pocket of her trousers, even as she started putting away her tools. Hopefully she'll be able to give me some advice on what I should do. See the end of the chapter for more. Notes: Forgefire Manor. It took him a couple of minutes of searching, but eventually, Azoth was able to find an empty room on the 3rd floor of the manor house. Looking around at his lodgings for the foreseeable future, the snow elf couldn't help but smile as he looked around at the large, richly decorated chamber. The Hephaestus familiar was clearly a wealthy one. The room had gleaming wooden paneling along all 4 walls, which hide the cold stone walls behind. It also had large set of bay windows with a number of plain sheets of glass in it, both giving the room a good view, but also sheltering the room against the elements. In terms of furniture, there was also a large double bed with a thick mattress on the frame at the far end of the room, with a pair of heavy-looking dressers and a hefty wooden wardrobe beside it. On the other side of the room, there was an empty desk, a work table, and wooden chair, with an empty weapons rack bolted to the wall next to the desk, and a pair of standing, wooden mannequins in the corner. Overall, the room was very grand, expensively furnished, and far better than he was expecting, especially with it being free. Grinning slightly at this, Azoth unbuckled his belt from around his waist, and the belted sheath from his back. His smile still in place as he placed Dawnbreaker, his Daedric dagger, and Wuthrad on the weapons rack, even as he then began unbuckling his armor with practiced ease, taking the battered and scarred metal plates off of his body, and then putting them on one of the wooden mannequins. Within minutes he had transferred all of the armor, save for the boots, onto one of the wooden mannequins, which left him wearing nothing but his clean, but still stained padded shirt, his brown slacks, and the armored boots. Right, Azoth muttered, his hands on his hips as he looked around at the richly furnished, but barely lived-in room, a grin on his face. His weapons and his armor, that was pretty much all of his belongings. It was sad, Azoth thought, and he would happily acknowledge that himself. But he had literally nothing else. Once I get some more gold, or what is it they call it, Valis, I'll need to get some new clothes and stuff, maybe a journal or two too. Azoth muttered to himself as he looked around his bare room for a few moments, before it all got a bit too depressing. Nope, I think I'll head out now. Azoth continued mumbling to himself, at a loss for what else he could do for the rest of today, or at least until Hephaestus and the rest of his new familiar returned from what they were currently doing. With that in mind, Azoth grabbed his sword and belt from the weapons rack, checked his pouch of gold coins, and then left the room, pausing only long enough to lock his room behind him. It was time to go fleece a few merchants out of their merchandise. A few minutes later, heading out into the streets of Ororio, no longer weighed down by his armor, Azoth couldn't help but marvel at how peaceful and happy the city looked. The place was filled with monster-hunting adventurers and was built over the entrance to a gigantic, ancient dungeon that was filled with horrific monsters, and yet no one seemed that concerned or bothered. Walking down the high street, his right hand instinctively resting on the hilt of his sword and his money pouch jingling on his belt, Azoth soon found his feet leading him into the main shopping area, his violet eyes shifting backwards and forwards as he passed by numerous clothing shops, each of which seemed to cater to a different clientele, with one of the shops having barely substantial underwear on display, only instead of displaying what was clearly underwear as underwear, the items were instead displayed as legitimate, outerwear, as if they expected people to purchase their goods and parade around in their underclothing. A glance inside of the shop, however, and at all the tanned, dark-haired women inside, was enough to tell Azoth that this was a shop clearly aimed at Amazons. He should have guessed going off what he had seen of those two Loki familiar Amazon sisters. Similarly, he saw a shop full of children, or Palums he assumed, then a shop which catered to dwarfs, and another which catered to animal people, complete with strategic holes in the clothing for extra appendages like tails and the like. Shaking his head at that, Azoth continued on down the street, ignoring the cries from some store owners around him as they attempted to sell food or drinks to passing shoppers. None of these shops caught his eye, not even the ones that seemed to be meant for humans and elves. All the items in there were just too boring and mundane. They were the kind of clothing he regularly wore back in Skyrim. They looked functional and to be of a good quality, but he wanted something flashy and new. Potato, fried potato. As he continued to walk down the high street, a familiar voice caught his attention. It was the goddess Hestia. He would recognize the short, incredibly busty, dark-haired, blue-eyed girl anywhere. She was pretty, distinctive. Yeah, go on then. I'll get a couple of these fried potatoes, Azoth called out with a smile, wandering up to the stall and the goddess, already fishing about in his coin purse for a piece of gold as he did so. Oh, hey, it's you, Hestia chirped, recognition spreading across her face, along with a grin as she recognized the white-haired, violet-eyed snow elf. Yep, it's me. So, goddess Hestia, how are you doing? Azoth replied easily, leaning against the stand as he waited for the busty goddess to get him his snack, absent-mindedly rolling the gold coin along his knuckle. Oh, you know, same old, Hestia waved him off, a smile still on her face as such. Put several odd-colored sauces on the potatoes he had ordered. My Bell did get himself into trouble with a minotaur the other day, though. Azoth paused as he heard this. Oh, Bell Cranel, the short, white-haired, nervous kid. You know him? Hestia asked, her voice partly delighted and partly surprised. Yeah, I met him at the Hostess of Fertility the other night. He seemed like a good kid, a bit nervous and lacking in confidence, especially when talking to women, but still not a bad kid. Azoth nodded, thinking on it how Bell had disappeared on him the other night just before he had started brawling with Beat. Not sure where he went though, as he kind of disappeared without a word quite early on. Oh yes, he does like going there, Hestia nodded, wrapping up the potatoes in paper now. He didn't mention meeting you last night though, or, well actually, he didn't really say anything about what he was up to. I just know he came back relatively early and went to bed. Maybe he drank too much. Azoth shrugged, flipping Hestia the coin and taking the wrapped-up snacks from her. Was Bell drinking last night? Hestia suddenly snapped, her eyes widening as she quickly twisted around to look at Azoth, her blue eyes flashing fiercely. No, I mean, well, he was drinking something, but what that was, let's say no. Azoth replied, somewhat taken aback by the previously bubbly girl's ferocity. It was a bit unnerving, almost like this was the boy's overprotective and borderline obsessive mother. Oh, well, I'm sure he wasn't. My Bell is a good boy. He wouldn't be as irresponsible as to go out drinking or messing about with floozies. Hestia nodded, her eyes opening a crack to look sideways at Azoth. Azoth had to withhold a smirk. The point she was trying to get across wasn't missed. It was, however, summarily ignored. I have to say, this isn't bad. Azoth spoke up, not even batting an eye at her previous comment as he instead dug into one of his fried potatoes and then changed the topic of the conversation. Aren't they? Hestia smiled widely, before she suddenly paused. So what are you doing here then, Mr. Adventurer? Shopping, Azoth replied dryly, polishing off one of the weird but pleasant-tasting snacks, before digging into another one. I didn't really have anything but my weapons, armor and the clothes I'm currently wearing when I first arrived here. So while I have the time, and a bit of coin, I'm getting some new things, just the essentials you know. Hestia nodded at that, her blue eyes roving up and down Azoth's stained shirt, worn-looking slacks and battered, armored boots. Thankfully, though, she was nice enough not to point out just how shabby he looked. Instead, Hestia put on a slightly coy smile and sidled over to him, even as he finished his last fried potato snack. So, have you found a familiar yet? Azoth paused as he heard the goddess's question. The girl in front of him had offered him a place in her familiar before he went over to the hostess of fertility. Despite that, though, he had gone off and joined another one. A small part of him felt a little guilty. Luckily, though, it was only a very small part. The rest of him, however, was quite satisfied that he made the best decision for himself, and also knew that living life just to please others was no life at all. No, you would only make your own life miserable if you did that. Wiping his mouth with the back of his hand, Azoth nodded to the goddess's question. Yeah, I joined the Hephaestus familiar earlier today. As a smith, it was the best choice for me. Oh, Hestia muttered. He could hear the disappointment in her tone, and also see it broadcasted across her face. Sorry, Azoth shrugged. No, it's fine. I know Hephaestus, she's a good friend of mine, Hestia replied, waving his half-hearted apology aside. You also probably made the right choice. The goddess of smithing's familiar is probably the best one for a smith. How magnanimous of her, Azoth thought dryly. Honestly, she wasn't that bad for a divine being, and neither were Loki or Hephaestus either for that matter. In fact, if he hadn't been told that they were goddesses, he probably would never have known. Or at least in Hephaestus's case, he wouldn't have known until she went to give him his Falna. He had definitely noticed the immense power in the redhead's lithe body when she had done that. Right, so shopping, Hestia chirped, once again back to being as bubbly as she had previously been. What kind of thing are you looking for? Sometime later. Entering the shop the Hestia had directed him to a few minutes later, Azoth grinned as he stepped inside. This was a lot more like it. All around him he could see mannequins wearing fancy-looking clothes, similar to what those guild workers had been wearing the other day, only nicer. Looking around he could see elegant gowns that made even the regal clothing the High Queen of Skyrim wore look cheap and drab, and flashy male outfits, button-up shirts, matching smart slacks and black jackets. It was all so different, and so interesting. Still grinning, Azoth immediately grabbed several items that caught his interest, even as he swept past one of the shop workers and headed to a curtained-off area where he could see other customers waiting to try on clothes. As he did this, he didn't miss the dismissive glances his current apparel garnered him, nor the cautious speculative looks a few also gave him once. They took note of the gleaming sword at his hip. Ignoring them all, Azoth cheerfully barged into one of the changing rooms and began trying on suit trousers and jackets, shirts, and waistcoats, as he later found they were called out. The snow elf having a grand old time, as he spent a day relaxing and playing around, a far cry from how he usually spent his days. It was nice just to lounge around and be a little idle sometimes, as opposed to delving into dungeons or raiding tombs and castles, even if the latter was far more exciting than the former, especially since the novelty of playing around, treating oneself tended to wear off quite quickly. Hey Azoth, is that you? The familiar voice of Tiona called out suddenly, attracting Azoth's attention as he stood in front of a mirror, several bags of now-bought clothing at his feet as well as his folded and bagged old rags, even as he adjusted his current outfit. With Azoth having donned a pair of black leather boots, black slacks, a white shirt and a gray waistcoat with silver thread embroider along the edges. He looked pretty damned good, if he said so himself. Oh yes, Tiona, Azoth replied, turning from his reflection as he instead looked over to the Amazon girl, his relaxed violet eyes tracing over the Amazon's busty sister, Tyon, the blushing, brown-haired elf girl, Lefia, and the pretty, doll-like human, A's, all of whom he could see were looking back at him in surprise. Really, you shop here? You? I would have thought someone like you would go to a cooler place, Tyon asked, crossing her arms below her bust, even as she gave some of the frilly dresses around her a disgusted look. This place is lovely. You just don't like it because they don't sell clothing that makes you look like a sex worker. Lefia shot back, her face still red as she tore her blue eyes away from Azoth, and instead over at the Amazon. Pretty much, yeah. Tyon shrugged nonchalantly. Tiona, however, had stalked over to Azoth, her green eyes raking up and down his form. I don't know, I think this stuff suits him. I mean, he's an elf, isn't he? Like Lefia and Reveria. They're all a bit stiff and stuffy. Stiff and stuffy, Azoth repeated bemused, even as he went back to checking out his reflection. I wouldn't say I was all that stiff and stuffy, but still, I look pretty damned good. Yeah, he does. Lefia chipped in, only for her to go bright red as the other four looked at. Huh. I mean, the waistcoat suits him. Azoth smiled wryly as he heard her words. She was a pretty girl, but a bit too young, innocent and naive for his tastes. On top of which she seemed too prim and proper. He had tried it on with nobles before. It never worked out well. Azoth's rough upbringing, blunt demeanor, and profession never mixed well with uptight, spoilt knobs. Still, he wasn't about to say anything and embarrass her. He would allow her crush, in the hopes that she would grow out of it, and if she didn't and she pushed, well, he would let her down gently. That, or depending on the circumstances and any other hidden sides she might have to her, he might give her a chance. Honestly, he didn't know. Then again, he never did. His history with women was very similar to his history of adventuring, which is to say all over the place, sometimes dangerous, sometimes exotic, and it always ended, sometimes well, but sometimes not so well. Thanks, Azoth said to Lefia, glancing over at the younger elf for a moment, before he then locked eyes with the doll-like girl, A's. This girl, he couldn't help it, she unnerved him a bit. The people of Skyrim, they were an emotional lot. They openly laughed, argued, fought, and loved. They might appear stoic on the battlefield, but when in the company of their friends and comrades, well, they were as boisterous as it was possible to be. She was an odd one. Even looking into her golden eyes now, he couldn't see a flicker of emotion within them, nor a single inkling as to what she was thinking or feeling on her face. Yes, Azoth thought, as he met her placid golden eyes with his own violet ones, she was a very odd one. So, what are you lot doing here? Azoth finally asked, tearing his eyes away from A's as he instead looked to Tiona, a bemused look spreading across his face as he saw her examining one of the frilly dresses cautiously, like it was about to come to life and eat her at any moment. We're shopping for A's. Lefia chirped happily, clutching onto the emotionless blondes. As she did so. Yeah, we took her to one of our shops earlier, but then poor Lefia almost fainted, so we came to this one instead. Tyon added on, a look of distaste on her face as she looked around. Well, I wish you luck then. Azoth nodded, a half grin on his face. Oh, thanks. Tiona grinned as she sidled up to him and threw an arm around his broad shoulders. Oh yeah, by the way, that fight with Beat last night, you were pretty amazing. Back then. Yes, he knows. I think you told him that about 50 times last night. Tyon sighed exasperatedly. Oh, did I? Tiona replied, sticking her tongue out in thought. You're strong. Ace suddenly said, her tone soft, so soft in fact that were it not for Azoth's enhanced hearing he might have missed it. Yeah, you're telling me. Tiona grinned, with an empathic nod. Azoth grinned in response. He did enjoy it when people recognized his strength, especially when that person was a pretty Amazonian with no concept of personal space. Tiona might not be as busty as her sister, but he wouldn't deny that her pressing her firm, strong body against him wasn't pleasant. Oh, by the way, Mr. Azoth, did you join a familiar yet? Lefia suddenly chipped in, the shadow of a frown passing over her face as she saw the way Tiona was clutching onto him. Yeah, that's a good point, Lefia. What about it, Azoth? If you haven't, you could come join the Loki familiar. Tiona beamed, her smile widening as she clung onto Azoth even closer, much to Lefia's noticeable chagrin. I'm not sure you should be saying that, Tiona. Tyon suddenly cut in, an uncertain expression on her face as she looked at Azoth. That would be more down to Loki, Finn, Reveria and Gareth than us. Well, that doesn't really matter. Azoth shrugged, an easy grin on his face, even as his perceptive eyes caught the hint of caution in Tyon's green eyes as she looked at him. The girl seemed ill at ease, especially after Tiona's suggestion. It made him wonder, did the older Amazon's sister know something the others didn't, maybe something that made her believe that he, Azoth, wouldn't be all that welcome in the Loki familiar? What do you mean? Tiona asked curiously. I joined the Hephaestus familiar earlier today. Azoth shrugged, a grin on his face. Oh really? That's lame. Tiona groaned, the younger girl looking distinctly put out now. Does that mean that you're a smith? I thought you were a warrior. Lefia asked, the elf girl, masking her disappointment far better than the Amazon, even though Azoth was still able to notice it. What with these magic hands? Azoth grinned, raising his long, pale hands as he did so. You'd be in awe of what I can do with these. Almost immediately Lefia flushed bright red, which was something both Amazon's sisters seemed to notice, as Tiona released him and then joined her older sister in ruthlessly teasing the young, pink-faced elf maiden. Turns out, Azoth chuckled to himself, the prim and proper elf had a bit of a dirty mind. Genuinely, he hadn't even thought of there being any innuendo in his words. Noticeably, as the two Amazons teased the very red-faced elf, Aze kept her golden eyes on him, her head tilting to the side curiously as she did so, before, without a single change in her facial expression, she spoke again. What level are you? Miss Aze. Lefia cried out, fighting her way out of the Amazon's sister's clutches as she instead turned to Aze. It's not proper to ask such a question of an adventurer from another familiar. Oh come on Lefia, it's not that bad. All the adventurers' levels are a matter of public record, it's just their statuses and skills that you're not supposed to ask about. Tyon chipped in, rolling her eyes at Lefia's actions as she did so. Yeah, it's not that rude. Besides, this will make it fair, Tiona added in with a grin, ignoring a nearby sales clerk that looked to be teetering on the edge of asking them to stop making such a commotion, as she instead looked over to the bemused snow elf. Me, Tyon and Aze. We're all level 5s, and Lefia over there, she's a level 3. Azoth nodded as he heard that. He now understood what they meant when they were talking about levels. After all, Hephaestus had shared this with him at least that much, even if she had said she wanted to talk with him in more detail about his status later. Oh okay, that's good. Azoth nodded, an impressed look on his face as Tiona practically preened in front of him, even as Tyon and Lefia seemed to stand a little straighter, and Aze just stared at him. I'm level 6. Almost at once the four reacted. Tyon and Tiona gawping in shock, their shoulders slumping slightly. Lefia raised her hand to her mouth, to hold in an eep of surprise, even as she stared at him with wide-eyed awe. Aze, however, just narrowed her eyes a fraction. So that's how you beat so easily. The golden-haired girl stated bluntly. It was the most he had ever heard her say before. Pretty much, Azoth grinned. I was an experienced adventurer even before I came to Rio. But still, how did you get that strong outside of the city? I thought it was like insanely difficult to get over level 2 out there. I mean, sure there are exceptions, but still, a level 6. Tyon asked, her eyes widening as she realized the difference in strength between the four of them and Azoth. Noticing the Amazon sisters' reaction, Azoth was pretty sure he knew why they were reacting the way they were. For someone who must be used to being one of the most powerful in Rio, it was probably a bit of the shock to the system to meet someone stronger than you, and a previously unknown, or unheard of, someone too. I killed monsters, of course. Azoth grinned, patting Dawnbreaker at his side as he did so. Mainly undead and dragons, and even once or twice an undead dragon. Dragons? Aze asked intently. Yep, dragons. Azoth replied, the smile still on his face, though that smile dimmed slightly when he remembered MIA Grand's warning about not speaking about Alduin in public, and instead only with the guild and his god. Apparently the World Eater had garnered quite the reputation for himself since he arrived here. Quite the reputation indeed, if even powerful adventurers and gods feared to speak his name. Bloody overgrown lizard. Well anyway, I'll probably leave you to your shopping. Azoth suddenly spoke up, reaching down and picking up his bags as he did so, his comment noticeably surprising three of the 4 girls in front of him. What really? Tiona whined disappointedly. Afraid so. I need to dump this lot back in my room and get ready to meet the rest of my familia. Azoth shrugged, before leaning in and lowering his voice. Plus I think the staff are getting a bit sick and tired of us being here, and are about to kick us out. Hearing the last part of his words, the 2 Amazons and Lefia looked around, and did indeed notice that several sales clerks were giving the group the stink eye. None of them looking too happy about the noisy group of 5 causing a ruckus, taking up a lot of room in the shop and not even buying anything to boot. Ah yes, Lefia muttered, her face going a bit pink again, even as she began nervously playing with the end of her long, waist-length ponytail. That's fine, we were done here anyway. Tyon shrugged, not looking at all bothered by the faces of the clerks. In fact, she looked pretty happy about the prospect of leaving. Hey wait, we only just got here. We've not even had the chance to look around. Lefia cried out, much to Tiona's amusement as the Amazon girl began cackling evilly, her sister likewise grinning as she grabbed Ace by the shoulders and began steering the blonde of the shop. Chuckling at this, Azoth shook his head in amusement and made to leave too, calling out his goodbye to the Loki familiar adventurers as he left, getting 3 corresponding goodbyes. Even as the 2 Amazon sister and Lefia fought over where they would be taking Ace next. He was kind of glad that he had gone shopping alone. Back at Forgefire Manor. Azoth, welcome. Hephaestus called out with a smile as she saw Azoth enter the room, the last of the familiar to arrive, as requested, with him no longer wearing the stained and dirty clothing he was wearing before, but instead a clean, new set of clothing. The snow elf now remarkably cleaner and tidier than he had been the first time she met him, earlier that day, with the red-haired goddess currently sitting at the head of a long, rectangular table in the manor's main hall. The other 37 members of the familiar all sat around her, all of them waiting for the newest member of the familiar to arrive. With Sabaki Colbrand, a tall, attractive, curvaceous, tanned, dark-haired woman, with an eye patch over her left eye, sitting on one side of the goddess. The half-dwarf Smith sitting on the goddess's right side, as befitting the captain of the familiar. The rest of the familiar, meanwhile, were spread all around the table, not seemingly sitting in any order, or dressing in any strict dress code, as the members wore a variety of clothing, in a variety of styles, from smart to casual, with some, like the short, pink-haired Lisbeth, wearing a smart, slightly frilly red dress, whilst others, like the tall, dark-skinned, bald man next to the Paolum girl, wearing a vest and work trousers, probably the clothing he had been wearing at the forge earlier in the day. Thanks. Azoth nodded as he confidently entered the room, conscious of all the eyes on him. As he strolled in through the large doors, his back straight and shoulders square as he surveyed the watching familiar members with his own intense violet eyes. Hephaestus had wanted to make a show of this. For that reason she, and her captain, Tsubaki, had met with him beforehand, even as the rest of the familiar filtered in and took their seats, both of them telling him to wait outside until called so that he could be introduced to the rest of the familiar at the same time. Familiar, Hephaestus continued, leaning forwards in her chair as she recaptured the rest of the familiar's attention, a slight smile on her face as she looked around at them, before she gestured to her newest familiar member, a warm smile on her face. This is Azoth, the newest member of our familiar. Hello, it's a pleasure. Azoth said, nodding his head as dozens of his fellow adventurers greeted him, with some, like the tall, bald man, who looked like native of Hammerfell, and the small, dark-haired, elf-like human next to him, smiling and loudly welcoming him, both of them clapping and calling out greetings and congratulations. Others, meanwhile, like Lisbeth and like the tall teen with short red hair and tanned skin, who was sitting on the other side of the pink-haired Paolum, were quieter in their welcome, clapping and nodding to him, but not leaping to their feet or showing any real enthusiasm. Still there were others, like the muscly Amazon girl on Tsubaki's other side, who barely looked up, with the dark-haired girl in question instead fiddling with some kind of mechanical gizmo in her hands, seemingly oblivious to all else. Walking along the edge of the table, Azoth sank into the empty seat on Hephaestus's other side, her left-hand side, a slight smile on his face as the familiar members all around him continued to talk, either amongst each or other, or for those close to him, to Azoth himself. Almost straight away, Azoth could see that they were all, mostly, a friendly and eclectic bunch. So have you settled in? Hephaestus asked, drawing Azoth's attention to her as she did so, his violet eyes flicking sideways, only for them to widen a fraction as he saw that she was wearing a fresh white shirt and the same tight black trousers and black boots as before. In the light of the room, the ensemble were far more noticeable than they had been in the darkness of the forge. Yes, I even got out and about and managed to pick up some new clothes from the city's high street. Azoth nodded, sitting up straighter as he noticed how a silence had quickly begun to descend on the table. I noticed, they look good, Hephaestus nodded, before with a slight smile she looked back to the rest of the table. So as I was saying, this is Azoth. He is the newest member of the familiar who just joined today. His is not, however, not a new adventurer. Instead, he is a seasoned veteran who just arrived in the city from outside of Rio. The other members of the familiar all started muttering amongst each other curiously as they heard this, with Lisbeth noticeably frowning, before she turned and spoke quietly to the bald man next to her, whose name was Egil, or at least going off what Azoth's heightened hearing could pick up, with the pink-haired girl telling the taller man about her meeting with Azoth earlier today. Likewise, the elf-like human, Leo, turned and started muttering excitedly to the red-headed teen next to him, a guy called Welf apparently, with Leo audibly cursing the fact that the new guy wasn't a girl, after which, instead of talking about Azoth, he started ruminating on his desire for more beautiful girls to join the familiar, much to the red-haired man's amusement. On Azoth's other side, he saw Tsubaki lean over to the muscly Amazon girl next to her, Nissa, with the half-dwarf captain audibly telling the other girl to pay attention, even as the large, brawny, dark-haired man on Nissa's other side, Beckendorf, let out a loud, cheerful laugh at Nissa's actions, after which he began teasing the distracted Amazon. It was all very relaxed and cheerful, or at least that was what Azoth thought as he looked around at the laughing, joking, and chatting group. What level is he, Lady Hephaestus? Lisbeth suddenly asked, her words causing an interested quiet to spread across the table as they all looked to their goddess for an answer. You say he is a veteran adventurer, so does that mean he is already level 2? Hephaestus's lips quirked up in amusement as she heard the pink-haired girl's question. The redhead not look at all perturbed about being questioned. You mean is he already entitled to use Lady Hephaestus's mark on the things he crafts? Tsubaki cut in, a smirk on her lips as she bluntly got straight to the point of Lisbeth's question. Well, Lisbeth went a little pink as she heard her Tsubaki's rejoinder, the Paulum fervently, looking away from the smirking Egil, who seemed to enjoy the fact that Lisbeth was being called out. Well, I didn't put it quite like that. But, well, yes. Is the newbie entitled to use Lady Hephaestus's mark, despite him just joining today? Azoth cocked an eyebrow as he heard this, his violet yes flicking over to the goddess of smithing curiously. This wasn't the first time he had heard Lisbeth referring to Hephaestus's mark. What Lisbeth is talking about is a familiar tradition, Hephaestus said, her words drawing the attention of the rest of the table, despite her directing them to Azoth. When a member of the familiar becomes level 2 and gains the development ability, blacksmith, I offer them the opportunity to put my mark, the familiar's brand, on what they produce, or at least as long as the armor or weapon, or whatever it is they are crafting, meets my standards, or my executive, Tsubaki's standard. For something you create to have the Hephaestus familiar brand, well, it is a symbol of recognition of the crafter's skill and the item's quality. Azoth nodded as he digested this, his eyes flicking around the table at all the interested familiar members. Nearly half of them were looking proud. This group he assumed were the ones over level 2 and with the development ability, blacksmith. The rest, however, looked resolute, or determined, or frustrated. These were the ones, he assumed, who were still attempting to gain that honor. But in answer to your previous question, Hephaestus continued, a smile still on her face. Azoth is currently a level 6 adventurer and has a development ability called Master Blacksmith and another called High Enchanter, both of which give him the right to bear my brand. Though again, he will only be able to do so as long as what he crafts meets with my standards. Almost at once absolute silence spread across the table, with everyone looking at Azoth in shock now, even the previously inattentive Nissa, with only Tsubaki and Hephaestus looking unperturbed by what was just said. His level 6. Lisbeth asked, her voice quiet and strained as she broke the suddenly tense silence, even as the Palum stared at Azoth in shock. The rest of the room echoing her reaction, though some of them looked more curious or speculative, and one or two looked a little cautious and suspicious. Lady Hephaestus, wouldn't that mean that he is the highest-ranked adventurer in the familiar? Agile question, his deep voice ringing out in the silence that followed Lisbeth's words, his brow furrowed as his intense dark eyes locked on Azoth curiously. It does, yes, but it doesn't change the fact that he is new to the familiar and will need to work to prove himself, just as everyone else does. Hephaestus nodded resolutely, the redhead, clearly choosing her words carefully. Yep, which means he will remain my minion for the foreseeable future, just like the rest of you. Tsubaki chipped in with a loud, good-natured laugh, her words and her tone of voice breaking the tense atmosphere that had previously enveloped the table. Minion? Azoth asked dryly, leaning forward to look at Tsubaki as he did so, his long pale ears twitching, even as a bemused smile played about the corners of his mouth. Yep, Tsubaki nodded unashamedly, a bright smile spreading across the beautiful, dark-haired woman's face. As the captain of the familiar, everyone here is my minion, save for Lady Hephaestus herself, of course. Ugh, don't bother fighting her on this, man, Leo piped up, groaning along with a number of other people at the table, the short, elf-like teen's eyes shifting over to Azoth. She keeps on. At this, it's kind of a thing with her. She's one of those girls who have a control kink, you know. I think it's called a domination fetish. Beckendorf laughed, the larger teen's booming voice ringing out throughout the hall, as he laughed a deep, infectious laugh that soon caught on as a number of other familiar members started laughing, even as Tsubaki went a bit pink and started vehemently denying that she had a fetish for dominating people. Looking around, Azoth blinked in confusion as everyone went back to talking and laughing, many of the members now digging into the food in front of them, or pouring out mugs of ale, or glasses of wine or water, most of them slowly becoming wrapped up in conversation, though some still sent him the occasional curious look. You get used to it, Hephaestus said dryly from beside him, a glass of wine in her hand as she watched the table descend into chaos. I love all my familiar members with everything I have, but there is no denying that most of them are barking mad. I prefer the term batshit insane. But still, that's just another way of saying that we're all eccentric, quirky, and interesting. Tsubaki cut in joyfully, her face still a little pink as she broke off from denying Beckendorf's accusations, and instead poured herself a large glass of wine, slopping some of the crimson liquid onto the table, even as she leaned over to speak with both Hephaestus and Azoth. I like it, Azoth said after a few moments, looking around the hall as he did so, a slight smile on his face, the atmosphere and the raucous bantering. It reminded him of the feasts he had regularly had in Jorviska with the rest of the companions. Every night he had spent at the hall had ended with drinking, shouting, boasting, storytelling, and of course, a brawl or a bit of swordplay, or some other kind of martial competition. I'm glad, Hephaestus smiled. They are a good group, though they are admittedly very inquisitive. I suspect that more than a few of them will have questions about where you've been, how you got so strong, and the techniques you have learned and weapons you have crafted. Try not to take offense, and feel free to put them off if you want to. They do all mean well, but please don't feel like you're under any obligation to tell them your life story or your secrets. Not to worry, Azoth smiled, waving off her concerns. I might not tell them everything about me, but if there is one thing I do enjoy, you know, apart from fighting or smithing, and, well, yes, well, if there is one thing I like doing, it's telling tales. I was a bard once, you know, not for long, but I joined a bard's college for a few months and was pretty good at it. You were a bard? Hephaestus asked in amusement, her eyes raking up and down his form. Even as Tsubaki let out a snort of laughter, a fine mist of wine spraying out of the beautiful, but far from elegant, woman's mouth. I wouldn't say that I was the best that there ever was. Azoth laughed. But I certainly could spin a tale as well as most, and have a lot of adventures that I have been on, and quests I have completed, to use when telling my tales. You'll have to regale us one night then. Hephaestus smiled, taking another sip of her wine. Sounds like a plan, Azoth nodded, raising his mug of mead in a toast of sorts, before draining it in a single gulp. It was pretty delicious. In fact, it kind of reminded him of black Briar Meaderous mead, a beverage local to the Rift that he was very fond of. That said, before you get too deep into your cups, Hephaestus continued, looking out over the rest of her, chatting and eating familiar for a moment, before glancing back at Azoth with her one visible eye. Once the feast is done, I would like to talk to you more about your status, and about some of your skills. Nothing intrusive, of course. I just want to relay what they all are, and get an idea of how some of them work. Again, you don't have to tell me everything, but I would appreciate a bit for information if you are willing, just so I know what you're capable of, and what you can handle. Azoth paused for a moment as he thought about her words, before, after a moment he nodded his assent. And then I will have you work alongside another member of the familiar, Hephaestus continued, with a slight smile, just until you find your feet, and to help you acclimatize to Orario and being in a new familiar. They'll also take you to the guild building tomorrow and help you register, and get you a guild advisor too. Maybe even take you down into the dungeon too if you are willing. Though if you do head down there you might need to borrow some armor for the moment, and I also wouldn't advise going down too deep, even for a level 6 like you, or at least not until you get a better idea of what it is like down there. Again Azoth nodded. I remember you saying, and I think I might do as you say and at least check the place out. Welf, Hephaestus called out, catching the red-headed man's attention as he broke off from the conversation he was having with the dark-haired Leo, and instead looked over to his goddess. I want you to take Azoth to the guild building tomorrow, and then show him his forge and workshop and help him get settled in. Is that all right? Welf paused as he heard this, his brow furrowing for a moment as he looked over at Azoth. Before, without a word, he shrugged and then nodded his assent. Thank you. Hephaestus smiled, her words causing Welf to go a little pink, before he quickly turned back to his food, his face going even redder as Leo once again started talking to him, a gleeful smirk on the elf-like teen's face as the younger boy clearly began teasing the redhead. Azoth, noticing this, smirked, and then chuckled slightly under his breath. He was pretty happy with his choices thus far, and was looking forward to what tomorrow would bring. Not only would he be registering as an official adventurer and member of the Hephaestus familiar, he would also be getting his first look at the massive dungeon that lay beneath the city of Orario. Chapter end notes. So what do you all think? This chapter had some world building and character development in, as well as some interactions with other characters. Most importantly, though, it allowed me to introduce the Hephaestus familiar, a familiar that is pretty much not at all developed, and in canon has only 3, now 2, named members, including the goddess herself. For that reason I have had to introduce other characters into the story to fill out the Hephaestus familiar's ranks. There are some fun Easter eggs in the familiar, which I reckon some of you will manage to pick up. Just to clarify, these aren't the Og characters, but are inspired off appearances and have vaguely similar traits. Nothing more than that though. They are not like-for-like copies, and never will be. I know some may think this is just filler, or that nothing is happening, but I would disagree. In my mind it is important to set out the context of the world and the familiar, and how Azoth and the rest of the characters interact. It is not just about action, as much as I do love action and fighting. It is also about interactions, exchanges between characters and the creation of connections. That said, the next chapter will not only have Azoth register with the guild and waltz back into some canon events, but it will also have him venture into the dungeon for the first time, and have him have some one-on-one time with a certain Welf Crozo. Plus, he'll be getting some temporary armor until he can forge his own, so we'll have an opportunity to be a bit judgy, as any master craftsperson would be when using something that they themselves did not create. On top of that, I am looking forward to exploring more about gods and monsters, as well as the other races, so of which I don't feel was fully developed or explored, or at least in the anime. So yes, a lot to look forward to. I hope you all enjoy the chapter and leave a review. Thanks for reading, and please do check out my other stories if you have the time. Catch you all later. Greed 720. Chapter notes. Chapter 8. Hey all, so here is the next chapter of the story. Hope you all enjoy it. Big thank you so far to all those who have favorite, followed and reviewed the story. This story turned out to be far more popular than I thought it would be. So thanks for that, I do appreciate all the support, and those that point out ways to improve the story. Hope you enjoy the new chapter. Thanks for reading, and if you have any questions or suggestions then please feel free to PM me. I'm usually quite good at answering those. Also please do check out my other stories if you have the time. Disclaimer, I do not own Elder Scrolls or Danmachi. Last time. Thank you. Hephaestus smiled, her words causing Welf to go a little pink, before he quickly turned back to his food, his face going even redder as Leo once again started talking to him, a gleeful smirk on the elf-like teen's face as the younger boy clearly began teasing the redhead. Azoth, noticing this, smirked, and then chuckled slightly under his breath. He was pretty happy with his choices thus far, and was looking forward to what tomorrow would bring. Not only would he be registering as an official adventurer and member of the Hephaestus Familia, he would also be getting his first look at the massive dungeon that lay beneath the city of Orario. See the end of the chapter for more. With Azoth. Notes. Waking up in his new bed the day after his welcoming feast, it took Azoth, for the second time in as many days, a few minutes to properly orientate himself and come to terms with his foreign, but very pleasant, surroundings. Pushing himself up out of his bed, his white hair messy and sticking up awkwardly in several places, a classic example of bedhead, he quickly cottoned onto where he was. This was his current residence, a room in the Forgefire Manor, the seat of the famous Hephaestus Familia. Smiling at this realization, Azoth got out of his bed and threw open the curtains, and then looked out onto the vibrant city of Orario. As places to stay went, or at least places he had stayed at before, this one was pretty great. Then again, considering he had slept in dungeons, tombs, stables, sewers, under the stars and in more than a few caves, one or two of which had been inhabited with trolls, that was not really saying very much. The fact that he had a comfortable bed was luxury enough, or at least in terms of comfort. In terms of quality of sleep though, well, as far as that went, it didn't matter what he slept on or where, be it a feather bed in a palace or plain rock outcropping on the top of a mountain. His beast blood never allowed him a restful slumber. Grumbling to himself at that thought, Azoth grabbed a nearby pitcher of water off of his bed side table and took several gulps, draining the contents and washing away his foul morning breath and the taste of stale alcohol that he could taste on his tongue and in his mouth. His regenerative healing factor and high metabolism, courtesy of being a werewolf, might burn off any alcohol quickly and neutralize it from his system. But unfortunately, his healing factor did nothing to ward off the dehydration caused by excessive consumption of alcohol. And currently he was pretty dehydrated, his pounding head told him that much. Of course, that just meant that the feast the previous evening had been a good one, and really, it had been. He had gotten to meet most of the familia, all of whom were unique in their own special way. Some, like Nissa and Leo, were eccentric in their own way, and seemed to be constantly fidgeting or fiddling with one or doodad or another. Others, like Beckendorf, Egil, and Sabaki, were loud, charismatic, and enthusiastic, the kind of people he liked drinking with. Still others were a complete mystery that he didn't get a chance to talk to properly, like Welf and the Pinkette, Lisbeth. That said, he hadn't really had a chance to speak to any of them in any real depth, but he at least had met them all briefly, all whilst sharing nearly a dozen flagons of ale and mead with them. If there was one thing the Hephaestus Familia liked to do, it was drink. Again though, that was something he could wholeheartedly get behind. Rubbing his face with his hand, Azoth got out of bed and started to dress himself. He was supposed to go to the guild building today and officially register himself as a member of the Familia. On top of that, he was supposed to be being shown to his personal workshop and taken down into the dungeon for his first foray too. Buttoning up one of his new shirts and pulling on a pair of charcoal-colored slacks and a pair of boots, Azoth quick got himself ready for the day to come. He would need to armor up for going down into the dungeon later, but for now he would stick to wearing something comfortable, stretching and twisting his body this way and that, ignoring the numerous cracks and pops issuing forth from his spine and shoulders. He paused only long enough to grab his belt and the attached sword and dagger off of a nearby weapons rack before he headed down for some food and to find either Hephaestus or that Welf kid, the one that was supposed to be showing him around. At the thought of his fiery-haired goddess, Azoth paused for a moment. He had spoken to her last night as well. Not in any great depth, of course, but she had taken him aside for a moment and showed him his stat sheet, and wasn't that a novel thing? Heading over to his desk, Azoth scooped up the page his goddess had shown him the previous night, his brow furrowing as he scanned down it and remembered the brief discussion he had had with Hephaestus the night before. Last night. Quite frankly, Azoth, your status is incredible, Hephaestus said bluntly, sitting behind her desk, an unreadable expression on her face as she pushed the scroll of paper across her desk and over to the still-standing snow elf. Picking up the scroll and unrolling it, Azoth had to hold back a frown of confusion as he inspected it, trying to work out what it all meant. The skills, development abilities, and spells he understood. They were all pretty self-explanatory. It seemed that the Falna, or blessing, that he had been given had recognized certain proficiencies and skills that he had honed during his time as Meridia's champion, and spells that he had learned, and then translated them over. How exactly it had done this, and what criteria it had used to do so, he had no idea. Nor did he think he ever would know. After all, the magic of the divine was far too esoteric and capricious for even a master archmage to understand, let alone an adept mage, at best, like him. Either way, though, he understood the basis of where his skills and abilities had come from. That all made sense to him, even if he wasn't totally sure what the letters next to his development abilities meant. What did confuse him, though, was what the other numbers and letters meant. Strength, B867. Endurance, S999. Dexterity, B715. Agility, C732. Magic, E567. He assumed they had to do with his level maybe, or his overall abilities, but that was really all he could infer. Shaking his head at this, Azoth continued to scan the parchment for a few minutes, taking it all in, before with a shrug he rolled it up once again and made to hand it back over to his goddess. Keep it, I've got a copy. Hephaestus replied calmly, the red-headed woman leaning back in her chair now and surveying him curiously as she did so. Fair enough, Azoth nodded, slipping the roll of parchment into his pocket without complaint. He would peruse it more at another time. Before you go, however, I was curious about one of your skills. Would you mind me asking you about it? Hephaestus pushed on, her expression still calm and her tone pleasant. This wasn't a demand or an order. Azoth could tell that much from the tone of her voice. It meant as a question, a request, one that he knew he could deny or refuse to answer if he so wished. But at present he saw no issue in divulging more about himself to the goddess. Thus far she had done right by him, and had proven herself to be pretty decent as far as celestial beings went. She was far more pleasant than Meridia had ever been, even on her best day, and, well, there was no comparison in regards the other Daedric princes he had met, most of whom were pure evil to say the least. Go for it, Azoth replied after a moment, sidling forward and slipping into the seat opposite Hephaestus as he did so. The chosen of Akatosh, the description says that this unique skills allows you to speak in the ancient language of the dragons, and that it gives you the capability of absorbing the souls of any dragons and then use the power and knowledge received from these devoured souls to unleash dragon shouts. Hephaestus paused as she said this, her red eyes flicking up to meet Azoth's violet ones. What are dragon shouts? Azoth smiled as he heard her question. That's a fair question, and one that is easy enough to explain in the most simplest of terms, but incredibly difficult to explain if you want more detail. Keep it simple then, Hephaestus nodded, her lip quirking upwards for a moment. If you don't mind. Not at all, Azoth replied easily. Dragon shouts are just that, shouts spoken in the ancient language of the dragons from my homeland. They are, I suppose you could say, words of power. You speak the words and reality conforms to make what you speak come to pass. Hephaestus's eyes widened a slither as she digested his explanation. So it is a form of powerful magic then, one that can be cast verbally, with no need for a staff or hand gestures. Pretty much, Azoth shrugged, she pretty much hit the nail on the head with her explanation, taking away all of the spiritualism, theology, and meditation that the Greybirds loved to talk about. The Thuum was essentially a unique form of magic. After all, just like with magic, the user could use their power to contort reality. Effectively, it was just magic, without the requirement for magicka to be used to wield it. Instead, it was powered by the strength of the user's soul. and the ability to absorb the souls of slain dragons and consume their power and knowledge. Hephaestus pressed. Well, it is pretty self-explanatory, Azoth shrugged, flashing a smile as he did so. I can absorb the souls of dragons. In doing so, I absorb both the soul's power, which I then use to bolster the power of my own soul, and my shouts in turn. Oh, and I absorb the memories connected to the soul too. Hephaestus frowned as she heard this, her brow furrowing. So you are able to devour souls? Yes, Azoth nodded. Only the souls of dragons, though. Hephaestus continued to look at him for a few moments after he answered, her red eyes boring into him curiously. I have never heard of a skill like this before, the ability to influence and interact with souls, even those of monsters and beasts. It has always been the soul domain of the gods. Yet I sense no lies coming from your tongue, nor would the status sheet lie either. It should be impossible. As she said this, Hephaestus continued to stare at Azoth, her eyes roaming over his face, hungrily, as if she were unable to look away. From my experience, Azoth said lightly, not at all uncomfortable with the attention. Nothing is impossible. The world is a large place and full of endless peculiarities. I've long since stopped pondering on what is and is not impossible, and have instead decided to take it all in stride. Hephaestus's gaze softened slightly, and her lips quirked upwards in amusement. Well put, I always forget how odd you mortals are. You're kind, you are all so capricious and unpredictable. Even after all the centuries that I have lived amongst you mortals and alongside you, your kind still find new ways to surprise me. The redhead let out a slight laugh as she said this, amusement and joy entering her gaze now. As she continued to gaze at him warmly, her lips curving upward into a genuine smile as she continued to gaze at him in fascination. Well, we like to keep things interesting, don't we? Azoth replied bemusedly. Yes, you do, Hephaestus laughed, standing up from behind her desk, with Azoth quickly mirroring her actions. Well, come along then, Azoth. You've answered everything I want to. No, let's return to the party. I am sure more than a few of your new brothers and sisters will still be up and about. It's one of the good things about my familia, my children. They may like to work very hard, but they like to play just as hard too. Ha, they sound like my kind of people, Azoth said warmly, following the beautiful redhead. As she led the way back to the party, a smile still very prominently on her face. Walking down the stairs, Azoth quickly entered the hall where the feast had taken place last night, his violet eyes flicking around the room as he entered, only for him to see that it was pretty much empty. At present there were only 3 people sat at the large dining table, Leo, Beckendorf and Welf, the trio of teenage boys or young men that he had met in passing last night. Morning, newbie. Leo called out the moment Azoth entered, the short, half-elf grinning cheekily as he kicked out a chair next to him and gestured him over. Careful there, Leo. That newbie could turn you into mincemeat if you're not careful. Beckendorf laughed, the large, broad-shouldered human smith cuffing the shorter teen around the back of his head, before he then ruffled the smaller teen's curly black hair and grinned over at Azoth in welcome. I know it was just a joke. Leo rolled his eyes, fighting off Beckendorf's large hand. As he did so, taking the seat offered, Azoth quickly started helping himself to breakfast. Not many others around are there. Nah, most of them are probably at their forges by now. That or they're sleeping in after drinking too much last night. Beckendorf shrugged, before grinning good-naturedly at Azoth. By the way, I don't think we spoke properly last night. I didn't introduce myself properly. The name's Charles Beckendorf, but everyone just calls me Beckendorf. Nice to meet you. Azoth nodded, taking the proffered hand in his own, noting as he did so the numerous callus on the teen hands and the roughness of his skin. The man definitely had the hands of a blacksmith. I'm Leo Valdez. It's short, sweet, and the ladies love it. Leo piped up next, grinning up at Azoth as he did so. Azoth fought back the desire to roll his eyes at this. Honestly, it was still early in the morning, and the kid was hyper. He was acting like a kid that had just eaten a dozen sweet rolls in a row and now didn't know what to do with himself. Pleasure, Azoth nodded dryly. It was a bit too early in the morning for someone to be acting so damned happy. It was unseemly. I don't mind Leo, he's just a spaz, he doesn't mean any harm. Beckendorf laughed, ruffling Leo's hair again much to the shorter boy's irritation as he tried and failed to fight him off again. Smiling at this, Azoth finished dishing out his breakfast and looked to the last member of the group. It's Welf, isn't it? Welf looked up as he heard his name called. The tall, red-headed teen eyeing Azoth cautiously. As he did so before he nodded. Yeah, it's Welf, Welf Crozzo. Azoth nodded in reply, watching Welf curiously as he did so. The way the teen was looking at him, it was almost as if he expected Azoth to recognize his name. I think I spoke to you briefly last night. We spoke. But you were pretty drunk at the time. Welf nodded, his brow knitting together as he eyed Azoth. Apparently this was not the reaction the teen had been expecting. It's the best way to be at a feast, Beckendorf laughed. Azoth nodded at that, a slight smile on his face as he glanced sideways at the dark-haired human. He was loud and proud, like most Nords tended to be. He could see himself getting along with the teen. So anyway, Azoth, I have to ask, why did you join this familiar? Leo suddenly spoke up, leaning forwards as he did so. I mean, you're level 6 adventurer, a first-class one, right? You could have been accepted into any familiar you wanted, even the Loki or Freya. Familiars. Not that I am complaining about you joining the Hephaestus one or anything. I'm a blacksmith at heart, Azoth shrugged. This familiar was the best choice for me. I mean, it gave me access to a forge and all the tools I need, and an opportunity to join a party, heading into the depths of the dungeon and acquire rare items and materials when I need to. That is true, it is handy having a personal workshop. Beckendorf nodded. What do you specialize in, by the way? Do you forge weapons, or armor, or something else? Predominantly weapons and armor. Azoth replied with a shrug. I supposed you could say that I specialize in enchanted items, though. Magic swords? Beckendorf asked, his gaze flicking down to the beautiful, sheathed sword at Azoth's hip, before oddly enough flicking over the quiet Welf. Amongst other things, yeah. Azoth said, looking between Welf and Beckendorf curiously. As he did so, for the moment though, I need to forge myself a new set of armor. My old one got a bit too banged up and isn't all that serviceable anymore. Leo grimaced. It's shit when that happens. I mean, I know it come hand in hand with making weapons and armor. You know them being used and abused. But still, it's always a punch in the gut when you find out that something you made was destroyed. The curse of being a smith, Beckendorf shrugged. We all have to get used to it. True, but I always like to think positive and take any failure as an opportunity to improve on what I did before so that it doesn't meet the same fate. Azoth added uneasily. That also is part of being a smith. You need to keep developing and honing your skills constantly, evolving and improving your craft. I'll drink to that, Beckendorf laughed, lifting a glass of orange juice into the air as he did so. Azoth smiled, and did the same, his smile widening slightly as he tasted the sweetness of the juice. It was good. So anyway, what are you up to for the rest of the day? Beckendorf continued jovially. I'm being shown around mostly. Hephaestus said she'll show me my new forge later. Now though, I need to head to the guild building and register as a part of the familiar, and then I reckon I'll get some cheap armor and head into the dungeon. Azoth shrugged, before looking over at Welf. I am not sure if you remember, Welf, but... Yeah, I remember. Welf cut him off, his tone not aggressive, but still slightly impatient. That's why I'm still here and not in my workshop. What's this? Leo asked curiously. Lady Hephaestus asked me to show him around and take him to the guild building, and then down into the dungeon. Welf shot back, his tone again bordering on impatience. Internally, Azoth sensed that the younger man was not entirely happy with the duties his goddess had foisted upon him. Cheer up, Welfie, Beckendorf laughed. It'll only be for a few hours, and then you can go and hole yourself up in your workshop again. Yeah, besides, it's not like anyone buys your armor anyway. Leo tagged on, his elfin features twisting up into a teasing smile. Welf scowled at the comment though. Apparently he didn't appreciate the teasing, even as turned to look at the diminutive half-elf. Before he could say anything, however, Beckendorf had already acted and had cuffed Leo on the back of his head. That's enough, Leo. You need to learn when enough is enough. Sorry about that, Welf, but you know Leo, he can be a right little shit sometimes. Hey, I'm not. Leo shouted out. I didn't need your help. Welf said harshly at the same time, an awkward tension suddenly descending on the eating group. Welf now scowling down at his food. Leo frowning and playing about with the remains of his breakfast, with him occasionally sending irritated looks at Beckendorf and awkward glances at Welf as he did so. Beckendorf, however, just looked resigned. Something I'm missing here. Azoth spoke into the sudden tense silence. It's nothing. Welf replied suddenly, standing up from his seat as he did so. I'll be waiting in the hall for you. We'll go when you've finished. With that said, the redhead quickly left the room. Wait, Welf. Beckendorf called out after him beseechingly. Welf, however, ignored him and quickly left the room, the door slamming shut loudly behind him. Silence quickly descended around the table once again at this. What was all that about? Azoth asked bluntly into the silence. It's an ongoing issue, Beckendorf said after a moment, sending a slight frown at Leo as he did so. Welf. Well, Welf is one of the last members of the Crozzo family. You know, the family famous for creating the strongest magical swords in the world. And Azoth pressed, not admitting to the other two that this in fact was the first time he had ever heard of the Crozzo family and their apparently legendary magic swords. And Welf is the last of their family with the skill to craft magical swords. Leo said, shifting uncomfortably in his seat. Despite that, though, he refuses to make them. He says that they can't be relied upon and so just ignores his natural talent for making them and creates normal armor and weapons instead. It's waste. If that's what he chooses to do, then so what? Azoth shrugged. Well, there's a lot of smiths in the familiar that think he is wasting his gods-given talent. Beckendorf replied uncomfortably. If Welf made magic swords, then he could bring even greater acclaim and wealth to the familiar, more so than any other member. But instead he doesn't. For the sake of his own pride, he refuses. It annoys quite a few of the other smiths. You know the fact he has this skill but never uses it. You mean they are jealous and petty? Azoth asked bluntly, a slight frown on his face now. Basically, yeah. Beckendorf nodded. Welf's just been getting a lot of flack for his decision, and I guess it's starting to weigh on him. Hey, just to defend myself here. I meant what I just said as a joke, not as a criticism. Leo piped up defensively. Really? Beckendorf asked, the frown currently on his face completely at odds with the smile he previously wore. A scowl looked just plain unnatural on the previously gregarious man's face. Sounds to me like everyone needs to lay off him a bit, and like he needs to grow more of a backbone and tell people to piss off. Azoth mused out loud. He knew for a fact that if anyone mouthed off at him like that he would not take it for a moment. No. He wasn't the kind of person that allowed anyone to bully him. If someone had a go at him, he would turn around and give it back at them, except twice as bad. Yeah, I've tried telling people to lay off, and so have Tsubaki and Lady Hephaestus, and mostly they do, or at least most of the time. Beckendorf shrugged. Azoth nodded at that. Honestly, he wasn't surprised. A familiar was supposed to be like a family, and if this family were anything like the people he had grown up with in Riften, then that meant that there would be a lot of sniping, bitching, and fighting. Right, Azoth said after a few more minutes of silence, finishing off his breakfast as he did. So, I'd better head off, you know, things to do and all that. Okay, man, have a good day. Hope everything goes well. Beckendorf nodded, getting up from the table too as he did so. Also, when you see Welf, tell him sorry, okay? Leo didn't mean to be a dick, did you, Leo? Leo didn't reply to Beckendorf's words at first. Instead, he continued to play about with the remains of his breakfast. When Beckendorf nudged him with his arm, though, he finally deigned to reply. Yeah, tell him I'm sorry. I'll tell him that too when I next see him. Leo replied, not making eye contact with either of them. I'll pass it on. Azoth nodded, even as he turned and headed for the door, and then stepped outside. You two have a good day doing whatever it is you decide to do too. A few minutes later, making his way to the main hallway a minute or so later, Azoth found Welf already waiting for him. The red-headed teen currently wearing a black knee-length coat now, over the top of his dark shirt and slacks, and some light armor he had over his chest, shins, and forearms. Noticeably, he also had a blue scarf tied around his neck, with the teen also having a large, black-handled, single-edged great sword sheathed his back, and a large canvas bag on the floor at his booted feet. Good you're here, Welf said as Azoth approached, the snow elf himself wearing a white shirt, black slacks, and his black leather boots, with his sword Dawnbreaker on his right hip, and his Daedric dagger on his other. Sorry for the wait, Azoth replied with a smile. Just had to finish off my breakfast, because, you know, well as any adventurer should know really, it's the most important meal of the day. Right, Welf said unenthusiastically, before he nudged the large bag at his feet. I brought this for you. You can use it if you want. What is it? Azoth asked as he approached and came to a stop just in front of the shorter man, looking down at the bag now. Some armor I made. You said you didn't have any at the moment, didn't you? Welf replied, meeting his violet eyes with his own blue ones. I mean, you don't have to wear it if you don't want to. If you want to look for something better, then that's fine. Azoth didn't reply to that, or at least not at first. Instead, he opened the bag and pulled out a large, silver breastplate, his violet eyes scanning the surface of the gleaming metal as he inspected it for cracks, indentations, or other imperfections. It was light armor, not what he usually wore. But despite that, it was well made and serviceable enough. Sure, it wasn't a masterpiece. In fact, Azoth knew he could create a much better set out of either malachite, dragon scale, or moonstone and quicksilver, but still it would do the job. Not bad at all. Azoth nodded, a smile on his face as he looked up at Welf. I'd gladly wear it. Tell you what, give me a minute or two and I'll run up to my room, get the armor on, grab my axe, and then we can head off. Welf blinked in surprise at this, but then managed a slight smile. Yeah, sure. Grinning, Azoth hefted the sack of armor up and headed up the stairs. Sometime later, walking down the high street and in the direction of the guild building, both Welf and Azoth walked side by side, the two of them chatting amiably to one another, with Azoth now wearing a set of light armor, courtesy of Welf, the armor pieces having been strapped over his padded shirt and trousers, the recently forged armor pieces gleaming in the mid-morning sun as they walked. Perhaps more prominent than his new armor, though, was Wuthrad, with the large double-bladed battle-axe having also been strapped to Azoth's back again, even as Dawnbreaker and his Daedric dagger were sheathed at his right and left hip respectively. Heading towards the guild building, Welf, noticeably much happier than he had been before, pointed out different landmarks to the snow elf, enthusing on the different drinking establishments they passed, and on where the best shops for materials and supplies were. Azoth in turn took all this in stride. He had already explored the area the day before, and found a favored drinking establishment prior to even joining the familiar, the hostess of fertility. Despite this, though, he humored the younger man, and accepted his friendly intentions and advice all the same. Welf Crosso, Azoth noted, was actually a pretty decent guy, or at least he was once he stopped moping about. He was a good guy, pretty open and simple, but good all the same. There didn't appear to be a side to him. What you saw was what you got. It was refreshing, or at least it was for Azoth. Growing up in the Thieves' Guild in Riften, Azoth had become used to second-guessing people's intentions. It was a habit he still did, even now many years later. It was a habit that most people would call a mixture of paranoia and cynicism, but that he just called good sense. So anyway, yeah, this is the guild building. It's pretty much the most important place in the city, you know, besides the dungeon and the Tower of Babel. Welf said, coming to a stop in front of a massive, ornate-looked building, a set of marble steps noticeably going up to an open set of double doors just in front of them. It looks grand, Azoth nodded, eyeing the place up. And extravagant. Well, I suppose that is because it is. Welf shrugged, leading the way up the steps. The place acts as both a bank, the main government building, and a gathering place for adventurers to get information and quests. So yeah, it's pretty flashy. Azoth nodded at that, even as they entered the building's cavernous main room, a series of counters running along one whole side, behind which smartly dressed men and women of all races were sat serving adventurers and other customers. Come on, there is an open booth over there, Welf said, nodding towards one of the booths, behind which a dark-haired woman was sat, her green eyes locking on the pair as they approached. The woman, Azoth thought as they weaved their way towards her, had the ears and facial features of an elf. However, he noted traces of humanity in her features too. Her face was a little too round for an elf's, and her features, although pretty, were not quite angular enough. Now her ears long or sharp enough. Taking note of all of this, Azoth came to the conclusion that this woman, like Leo, was a half-elf. Good morning, adventurers. My name's Aina. How may I help you today? The now named Aina asked pleasantly, smiling up at the duo, even as Welf leant against the wall just beside the counter and then gestured for Azoth to step forward and do the talking. "Ah, good morning, Miss Aina. My name is Azoth and I am here to register for my new familiar," Azoth said, choosing to be a bit politer than he usually would be. After all, he knew from personal experience what these government and bureaucracy types were like. Treat them like shit and they would be purposefully slow and unhelpful. Be nice, however, and then they suddenly become much more proficient. "Oh, of course, that's no problem. I'll just need you to fill out this form," Aina replied, agreeably, a smile on her face as she pushed a sheet across the counter to Azoth, along with a quill and an ink pot. "Can I ask what familiar you have joined?" "The Hephaestus familiar," Azoth replied with a smile, taking the form and the quill before he then began to quickly fill it in. Fortunately, it was only asking for the most basic of information that he suspected that they would most likely corroborate with his goddess before they officially registered him. "Oh, I see, and thank you," Aina said, even as Azoth finished filling in the form and handed it to her, with her then scanning it over, likely to make sure he had filled everything he needed to in and not missed anything. It was a pretty simple form, and just required a name, an age, a familiar, and a level. It was the bare minimum in terms of information. No doubt this was because the different familiars in the city recognized that knowledge was power, and thus attempted to keep as many secrets as they could. "Wait," Aina said sharply, her tone catching Azoth off guard as he looked up at the suddenly startled-looking elf, Welf stirring too as he looked sideways. "This says that you're level 6. "Well, yes," Azoth nodded. "That's because I am a level 6 adventurer." "But then why are you only just now registering as an adventurer?" Aina asked, looking down at the form again. The half-elf looked like she was on the verge of having a panic attack. "And why have I never heard of you?" "Well, I am new to the city. I literally arrived here for the first time a few days ago." Azoth shrugged, scratching the back of his head awkwardly. "I mean, I am a seasoned adventurer. Already, I am just new to the city is all. So that why I am here, because I need to register here and get the mandatory guild advisor. Speaking of which, would it be you who would be my new advisor?" Well, yes, it tends to be policy that the one who registers the new adventurer becomes their advisor for their first month of dungeon diving," Aina said dazedly. "Brilliant. Then I look forward to working with you," Azoth said, a bright smile on his face as he looked down at the half-elf. "Yes, well, I look forward to working with you too, though honestly, I'm not sure how much help I can be to someone like you. Advisors are usually only assigned to new adventurers. Level 1s. I mean, I have heard of level 2 newcomers to the city being given advisors 2 when they first register, but I've never heard of a level 6 having one." Again, Aina sounded a little faint as she spoke, even as she continued to stare at Azoth in awe. Then again, considering there were apparently only a dozen or so level 6 adventurers in the known world, maybe this wasn't so surprising. "Well, either way, I look forward to your counsel and advice." Azoth nodded, a smile on his even as he stuck his hand out to the half-elf. Weakly taking his hand, Aina allowed him to shake it twice before she let go. Is there anything else I can help you with?" "No, I don't think so. I reckon Welf here can answer any questions I've forgotten." Azoth smiled, gesturing over at the redhead as he did so. "That said, though, Welf and I were going to head down into the dungeon now, if that isn't a problem." "Oh no, not at all. I'd say be careful, but well, considering you're level 1, think that such advice is a bit perfunctory," Aina said, trailing off at the end with a nervous laugh, even as she continued to fiddle with his registration form. "Not at all. In my experience, you can never be too careful, no matter how big and tough you are. There is always someone bigger and tougher out there," Azoth replied with a bright smile. "Well, yes, I suppose," said Aina, a weak smile still on her face as she began to fill in the bits of the form she was supposed to before passing it on so it could be approved, verified, and filed. "Well, anyway, thanks for all the help. I'll drop by after we've finished in the dungeon, you know, to cash in a few of those monster soul gems," Azoth called out, even as he started walking away, waving his goodbye to Aina as he did so. "Okay, good luck," Aina called after him, the half-elf still seemingly out of sorts as she then went back to staring at his registration form in amazement. "Well, she seemed pleasant," Azoth said as he and Welf headed back down the steps and towards the dungeon entrance. Really, she seemed a bit ditzy and out of it to me. I reckon you might have knocked her for a loop back there. Welf said with a short laugh as the two of them weaved their way through the crowds. True, she did seem a bit out of sorts. Azoth nodded with a slight laugh of his own. By the way, Azoth, back in the guild building, why did you call monster crystals monster soul gems? Welf asked suddenly, even as they began to near the Tower of Babel and the entrance to the dungeon that had long since been sealed beneath the colossal tower. Well, that's effectively what they are, aren't they? Azoth replied with a shrug. Welf sent him a quizzical look at this, but said no more as they soon joined a large crowd of other adventurers, all of them wearing armor both light, heavy and plate, or mage-like robes, and carrying a multitude of gleaming weapons, some which were magical but most of which was not, that or they were carrying long ornate staffs. Merging with the crowd, both Welf and Azoth soon found themselves descending the steps to the first floor of the dungeon, neither one of them drawing their weapons yet as they instead just followed the crowd of other adventurers into the gloomy labyrinthine-like first floor. The many groups of adventurers splitting up the further in they got, as some headed lower and others started hunting monsters on the first floor so as to warm up for what lay further below. So what do you want to do? Welf asked as he and Azoth departed from the crowd and began to walk through the dungeon's gloomy corridors, side by side. We can stay on this floor and get you used to dungeon fighting. Everything on this floor is pretty easy. Or if you want, we can head to one of the lower floors and start there. Well, you don't need to worry about me fighting in enclosed spaces. I have plenty of experience fighting in tombs and underground and such. Azoth said easily, placing his hand on his sword and drawing the first inch, loosening it so he could draw it quickly if he needed. 2. What's the furthest you've ever been? I made it to level 10 once. Welf shrugged, but that's the deepest I've ever been. For a level 1 it is probably the deepest you can safely go, and that's even with a group of 1 or 2 other, and even then it is a little risky. Fair enough, we'll stick to the first 10 floors for now then. I don't want to take you out of your comfort zone. Azoth nodded, his violet eyes narrowing as the two of them walked through the many passage, getting deeper and deeper into the dungeon, until without warning they arrived at a large dark cavern. You don't have to do that, Welf said, only to stop talking as he saw Azoth raise a hand, even as he saw the dark open space in front of them, Welf's own hand moving up to grip the hilt of his sword in readiness. Raising his hand, Azoth cast Magelight, a glowing ball of white light forming in his hand. Before, without a word, he threw it up and into the air, where it remained bobbing about in the air like a miniature sun, the orb bringing light to every crevice and crack in the area, revealing as it did so a score of small, dirty, humanoid creatures with dog-like features and long, sharp dirt-encrusted claws. Kobolds, Welf said unconcernedly, drawing his great sword. And there is a lot of them. This is a monster pantry by the looks of it. That was a good spot back there, by the way. I didn't know you could use magic, and magic without a chant either for that matter. Oh that's just a Magelight spell. It's pretty basic. I've got much better spells in my repertoire than that, Azoth said easily, reaching behind him and pulling Wuthrad off of his back as he did so, revealing to Welf for the first time the beautiful and terrifying carvings of battle and screaming faces on the blade as he swung it around and pointed it at the biggest and ugliest of the kobolds. By the way, that bastard's mine. What? Welf asked dazedly, tearing his gaze away from the deadly and beautiful axe as he instead looked over at Azoth. Azoth, though, had already jumped into action, his feet all but silent as he crossed the 10-meter distance between him and the group of kobolds in all but a few seconds, his large axe tearing through the air with a shrieking sound as he cleaved the first kobold in half with a single swing, before decimating 3 more before the foul creatures even knew what had happened. Hey, wait! Welf shouted, running forward with his own blade now, even as Azoth danced around the weak monsters, massacring them with impunity, not showing the slightest of strains, despite the obvious weight of his weapon. In fact, by the time Welf crossed the distance and joined the battle, 2/3 of them were already dead, and the rest were utterly panicking, which in turn made it even easier for the 2 smiths to finish off the last third, the whole fight taking less than 2 minutes, and leaving behind 20 or so small monster crystals and a couple of drop items for the victors to collect. So this was easy, Azoth said, swinging his axe up and resting it on his shoulder as he looked over at the thunderstruck Welf. How about we head down to level 5 next, and kill a few dozen monsters down there to warm up, after which I reckon we can head further, down to level 10, hopefully something down there can put up more of a fight. Yeah right. Welf muttered, looking around at the now empty cavern in surprise. Sure, why not? Chapter end notes. So what did you all think? We got some more interaction with his goddess, his familiar, the guild, and finally he makes it to the dungeon. The next chapter will show more about that as the plot begins to grow and expand. There will be bits of the sword, princess story arc and main story arc in this story, as well as some original stuff as I want to develop some of the other familiars in Rio and explore the dungeon a lot. More than I feel is done in canon, as in canon the story is focused on only a couple of familiar and the dungeon only invariably appears. Like Sirius, it appears once in the entire second season. Also congrats to those who picked up on the references to SAO and Percy Jackson characters. I'm impressed. That said, do remember that these are not those characters. Despite the naming, that was just a bit of whimsy on my part. They are instead their own characters and will thus act in different ways and have completely different ways. They are in fact OCS, just OCS that I've given names to that references blacksmiths from other fandoms. Again, just a bit of innocent fun on my part. There is not deeper purpose to it. But yes, anyway, I've got plenty of stuff planned. So thanks for all of the support, and I hope you continue to enjoy reading. Please do check out my other stories and whatnot. Thanks for reading, and I'll catch you later. Greed 720. Chapter notes. Chapter 9. So hello all, it's been a while, hasn't it? Sorry about that, I've just been very busy with real life. Started a new job, had Christmas rock up, had to deal with a busted up car. Run of the mill stuff that just takes up time. That said, I do appreciate all those who stuck with the story, and those who messaged me too, both about the story and out of concern. I appreciate the thought. That said, I have but an overall summary of my thoughts on all my active stories, so feel free to check that out if you follow any of my other stories. Other than that, here is the next chapter. I think I may need to refresh myself on the source material soon, as I've not worked on the story for a while, and so don't have all the pertinent plot points and events in my mind anymore. Other than that, I hope you all enjoy the chapter and leave a review. If you have any questions, feel free to PM me. Thanks for reading. Disclaimer, I do not own Danmachi or the Elder Scrolls. Last time. In fact, by the time Welf crossed the distance and joined the battle, 2/3 of them were already dead, and the rest were utterly panicking, which in turn made it even easier for the two smiths to finish off the last third. The whole fight taking less than 2 minutes, and leaving behind 20 or so small monster crystals and a couple of drop items for the victors to collect. So this was easy, Azoth said, swinging his axe up and resting it on his shoulder as he looked over at the thunderstruck Welf. How about we head down to level 5 next, and kill a few dozen monsters down there to warm up, after which I reckon we can head further down to level 10, hopefully something down there can put up more of a fight. Yeah right. Welf muttered, looking around at the now empty cavern in surprise. Sure, why not? See the end of the chapter for more. Notes. In the dungeon, swinging Wuthrad around, Azoth could both see and feel the axe's heavy, ornately decorated blade easily cleave through the large, grotesque body in front of him. The creature letting loose a screech of pain in response, its colossal mass lashing out in pain and anger. Its form, which easily stood over 9 feet tall, looming over the snow elf. Azoth wasn't sure what the pig-faced creature was, but from what he could see it was an immense, mottled, gray mass of fat, muscle and sadistic cruelty. Leaping back as the creature let loose a howl of pain and anger, Azoth managed to avoid a heavy swing from one of the creature's fellows, a quick smile crossing his angular face, even as he then darted forward, one of his armored boots landing on the attacking creature's club as it smashed into the ground, his hands whipping around as he then swung the long-hafted axe at the surprised beast, his violet eyes gleaming with delight as his axe bit deeply into the thick flesh around the attacking creature's throat, crashing backwards onto the misty floor, grayish-black blood fountaining out of the tear in its neck. The creature could only let out an agonized gurgle as it frantically spasmed on the ground, its giant, dirty gray hands, each of which looked big enough and strong enough to crush an average person's skull, scrabbling at its futilely throat as it rapidly died. Ignoring this pitiable sight, Azoth instead continued forward, his blade swinging up and around again as he hacked down the one he had previously injured, black blood showering down on him and the mist-enshrouded ground below him, even as he dodged around the beast's collapsing body and slammed his axe into, and through, the spine of another of the beasts. This was fun. Exploring the city of Ororio, his new base. Home, that was all well and good. So too was meeting new and interesting people, some of which belonged to races he had never even heard of before, whilst others were divine beings. Divine beings that weren't like the ones he knew, as in they weren't absolute psychotic monsters. All of that was interesting and exciting in a way, but it didn't hold a candle to the feeling of being in battle. Sure, his current foes were comparable weak when compared to some of the things he had fought over the years. Hell, he had fought bears that were tougher than these ogre-like beings. Despite this, though, he could still feel his heart racing and his soul soaring as he darted through the half-dozen large lumbering bodies, his axe a grey-silver blur as he cleaved through his enemies with ease. It was a difficult feeling to describe, really, the sense of oneness and joy that came with doing something you excel in, which in Azoth's case at the moment was fighting. If he could liken it to anything, he would say it was like the feeling he had when he was working in the forge, the heat of the embers scorching his skin and causing sweat to bead down his face, the ache in his arms as he used a hammer to pound a lump of metal into a work of deadly art, the satisfaction and sense of accomplishment that came with completing a project. Honestly, Azoth was a bit of a strange elf, and he knew it. He was not very magically inclined, nor was he all that good with a bow. Art, poetry, music, none of that came easily to him either, not as easily as it seemed to come to high elves, dark elves and wood elves. There was a reason he had been kicked out of the Bard's College after all, and it wasn't just because he refused to go on one of their many quests to find the multiple instruments and items that the wasters at the college seemed to lose. No, out of all of his kin, the only ones Azoth really felt any kinship towards were the Orizima, or the Orcs as they were commonly called. They were a warrior race that excelled in smithing and lived by a strict code of honor and duty, all of which Azoth could get behind. On top of that, the Orcs were shunned by the other elves, ignored and despised. As the last of the snow elves, or at least as far as he knew, he could understand the feeling. From what he had found out, when his kind had needed help, and had gone to their kin, the Dwemer, for aid, they had been tricked, abused, blinded and enslaved. Considering the way they were treated by their cousins, was it truly any wonder that his once proud race had devolved into the monstrous farmer? Azoth shook his head at that thought. His mind was wandering. If this had been an actually challenging fight, such a lapse in concentration could have been fatal. With that thought in mind, Azoth wrenched his axe blade out of the skull of one of the beasts, and then turned and jabbed Wuthrad forward like a spear, the spike-tipped head of the axe, stabbing up and into the throat last of the beasts. A look of shock crossing the creature's piggy face as it realized what had happened. Only for Azoth to finish it off with a bolt of chained lightning to the face, the lance of crackling, white lightning erupting from his free hand and frying the creature's brain. The force and ferocity of the blast incidentally causing its small beady eyes to explode too, splattering Azoth with black blood. Disgusting. Azoth muttered, taking a step back as he saw the creature fall back and then explode into black dust, a small purple soul gem falling to the misty ground, even as its essence, like that of its fellows, was reabsorbed by the dungeon. From what Hephaestus had told him, the monsters down here never truly died. They were sort of like dragons in that their souls continued to exist, even though their earthly forms were killed. Give it a few days or weeks and these creatures would be respawned somewhere within the dungeon, no doubt with a supreme hatred of axe-wielding elves. Rolling his shoulders, Azoth gave a cursory glance down at Wuthrad's flawless blade, inspecting the ancient weapon for any potential damage. Not that he expected to see any. If the blade could still keep its edge after crushing and breaking through Alduin all but impenetrable scales, then the chances of it getting damaged, whilst using it to fillet some porky monsters, were all but non-existent. That was. A voice spoke up behind him, attracting Azoth's attention as he swung his axe around, the blood sliding clean off of it and spattering onto the dark ground as he did so. That was impressive. The voice finished. Thanks. Azoth smiled warmly, strapping his axe back onto his back as he turned to face his red-headed companion. You didn't do that bad yourself. That must have been a good dozen. Imps you cut through with that big chopper of yours. As he said this, Azoth's violet eyes flickered over to red-headed Smith's weapon of choice. It was a 5-foot-long, single-edged sword. One which had a slight curve to it, a long hilt and no guard to speak of. The most noticeably thing about it, though, and the reason why Azoth couldn't help but think of the weapon as a chopper, was the width of the blade. The blade must have been 6 inches, plus wide at the tang, with the blade then gently tapering to the tip, the sword itself looking less like an elegant blade, and more like a cross between a falchion and meat cleaver. They are just imps. Welf replied brusquely, deliberately looking away from Azoth now and instead out at the dak and misty area around them. Smiling slightly at the younger man's actions, Azoth let out a chuckle. Aye, they may just be imps, but with nasty buggers like them, quantity counts a lot more than quality. Welf shifted at these words, but didn't immediately reply. Instead, he continued to stare out at their surroundings for a moment, before he turned back to Azoth and noticeably changed the topic of the conversation. So how's the armor holding up? Allowing the change in topic, Azoth glanced down at the once immaculate and brightly polished silver armor, and then grinned. 3 or so hours in the dungeon had certainly taken their toll on the protective gear. The light armor was now spattered with black blood and encrusted in dirt. Small scratches and nicks also littered the pauldrons and chest plate, damage caused by the general wear and tear of battle, and something that could easily be buffed out in an afternoon. Not bad at all. Azoth replied with a smile, his lip curling upwards as he saw a flash of satisfaction pass across Welf's face for a moment. As a smith himself, Azoth knew the feeling. It felt pretty good to have someone acknowledge your hard work. I'll admit it's a bit light for my tastes. I usually prefer heavier, more durable armor. But it is definitely doing its job, and I'll admit it is an oddly refreshing feeling to feel so free and light on my feet in a battle. Azoth continued. He knew what it felt like to be complimented for his work, but he didn't go out of his way to flatter people and stoke their egos. Welf's smile faded at this, but didn't quite turn into a scowl. Instead, the redhead looked thoughtful. You got any suggestions? I would try experimenting with different materials. If you want the armor to be light, but still strong, then it might be worthwhile to look at using monster hide and scales to reinforce the armor. That is, if you want it to remain light and flexible, whilst still retaining its strength. Azoth said, pausing for a moment, a thoughtful look on his face as he examined the armor. I mean, it's not bad, but to get the lightest of the armor you've needed to make the metal thinner, which in turn has affected its durability and the ease with which it picks up wear and tear. Azoth flicked his finger against a centimeter-deep nick on the edge of his pauldron to emphasize his point. If he could equate the armor to anything, he would say it was similar to a poorly made set of elven light armor. Better than nothing, but not as good as it could be. Again, Welf frowned at this, but he didn't dispute Azoth's words or act petulantly. I see what you mean, but it's easier said than done. Picking up the high-quality materials you're talking about is pricey. Don't get me wrong, Lady Hephaestus is generous, but if we want the really rare things, we have to get them ourselves, and to do that we need to sell our wares to make the money, make a contract with another adventurer or group of adventurers. That, or we have to head into the dungeon to harvest them ourselves. Azoth hummed at that, his brow slightly furrowed as he pondered over what Welf had just said. So why not just make a contract with an adventurer? There are certainly enough of them around Orario. Like I said, that's easier said than done. Everyone in our familia is constantly on the lookout for good contracts, and sure, like you say, it's easy enough to make a contract with a level 1, or even a group of level 1s, but those types would barely make it past the 10th floor. Welf sighed as he said this, and looked around at the floor they were on now, the 10th floor. What you need is a strong level 3, or maybe even a 4 or a 5. If you get one of them, then a contract is lucrative. If not, well, it's harsh to say, but it's not even worth the effort. Fair enough. So I'm guessing that's why most of you lot just sell your stuff on the 4th and 8th floor of the tower? Azoth asked. His brow furrowed as he once again found himself comparing this whole familiar thing with being in a guild. Yeah, most of us do. But only those that are over level 2 and have been recognized by Hephaestus can sell things on the 4th floor, and as you might have noticed, that's where You can sell things for ridiculous prices. Welf's tone was noticeably bitter as he said this. Up on the 8th floor, though, well, you're lucky if you can sell anything at all. Especially if people only buy your things because of your name and the expectations that come with it. This, Azoth mused, must have been what Beckendorf had mentioned before. The Crozo magic, swords and the fame attributed to them. Honestly, a part of him was curious about them and whether they could hold a candle to one of his enchanted swords, or maybe even his legendary blade, Dawnbreaker. Still, glancing at the scowl on the boy's face and the way his hands had clenched into fists at his side, he could see that this whole thing was a touchy subject for him. A touchy subject that he wasn't too keen on going into right now, especially considering how little he knew of the boy. No, Azoth decided as the silence continued on for a few more moments, he didn't want to touch that subject at all. Honestly, he had never been very good at this kind of thing. Tact, subtlety and sensitivity, it was not his thing. Damn, well, I suppose we should head a little deeper into the dungeon then. I'm yet to be satisfied by these weaklings. Plus, if I'm to start working in my new forge and crafting a new set of armor, then I think I need to familiarize myself with some of the materials I'll probably be working with. Azoth said with a nod, clapping his hands together loudly as he did so, before he turned and started walking, starting to collect up some of the larger magic stones that the ogre things had dropped as he did so. Right, Welf echoed, a hint of relief in the younger boy's voice as he sheathed his blade and joined the white-haired elf in collecting up the magic stones. The dungeon's not exactly the best place to be chatting anyway, especially this low down. Azoth hummed at that. By the way, what were those big ogre things I killed? What? Welf replied, a confused expression on his face. You've never seen an orc before. An orc? Azoth started, his violet eyes widening slightly, his lips twitching upwards slightly. As he did so, before a moment later he let out distinctly UN elf-like snort of laughter. That's what you call those things? Yeah, Welf frowned. Are you telling me that you, a level 6, has never seen an orc before? Oh no, I've seen orcs. Those things though, those are nothing like the beings I know as orcs. Those things are more like bigger, yet weaker, versions of trolls. Azoth smiled, shaking his head in amusement as he imagined the reaction of an Orizima to one of those orcs he had just killed. Trolls? Welf asked, his brow furrowed in confusion. Yeah, Azoth nodded, before he jerked his head and started walking, Welf following along. After him. Pretty nasty monsters to fight if you're new to adventuring. But once you've gotten a bit of experience and some good gear, well, they are honestly little more than a nuisance. Following along beside him, Welf listened in with interest as Azoth continued to tell him about trolls, including their strengths, weaknesses, and appearances, his brow furrowing as he tried to remember whether he had heard of things like them before, even as the duo continued, walking through the 10th floor, with Azoth occasionally unleashing a blast of lightning or whipping out his sword to deal with any monsters that were unfortunate enough to cross the level 6 path. Welf marveling every time the elf did this, both at the older man's reaction times and his senses, as more often than not he acted before Welf was even aware they were in danger, easily cutting down war shadows, orcs, kobolds, and imps with tremendous ease and speed. It was as he was witnessing this that Welf, perhaps for the first time, truly released the stark difference in strength between a level 1 and a level 6. Sure, it was easy enough to imagine the difference in theory, but when one actually witnessed a level 6 fighting for the first time, well, it was pretty extraordinary. Sometime later, as the two of them reached the end of the 10th floor and began to walk through the surpassingly large, rocky passage that led the way to the 11th floor, a floor deeper than Welf had ever been before, and a floor lower than Azoth had first suggested they would do. Welf couldn't help but ask Azoth something that had been bothering him. Hey Azoth, Welf began, the red-headed smith's blue eyes narrowing slightly as he stared through the gloom at Azoth, his eyes flickering from the tall, broad-shouldered elf to the glowing blue orb that was bobbing about in front of them. Him, Azoth hummed back, his violet eyes flickering to Welf for a moment, before he went back to looking further down the gloomy tunnel. I've been meaning to ask about your magic. You know that magelight thing, and the lightning spell you use. Welf continued, looking forward himself now as the pathway began to get slightly steeper and a reddish glow appeared further down the tunnel, visible proof that they were nearing their destination, the 11th floor. What about them? Azoth replied easily, his tone as relaxed as ever, something Welf had quickly noticed was the norm with the laid-back elf. Well, it's just I've noticed that you don't need a chant for them. Welf continued curiously. No, I don't. Azoth replied, his hand dropping down to the hilt of his sword as the pathway flattened and they neared the end of the tunnel and the beginning of the 11th floor. I have more spells than just those two, though. They are not the most powerful spells, mind you. There are much stronger spells out there, but they are useful enough. That and they are low cost in terms of magicka, and none of them require chants. Azoth looked sideways at the surprised Welf as he said this, before with a shrug he continued. Think of it like an additional skill. They are fast and quick to use, but lack the power of those spells that take longer. Oh, okay. Welf nodded, not sure what to say to that. Azoth was a distinctly odd and mysterious person, and a very powerful one at that. Not just due to his level, but also because of his weapons and magic too. Welf didn't have to be an expert to notice the sheer perfection of his two weapons, nor did it take him long to work out just how useful the skill to use chantless spells must be, even if they were, like Azoth said, not that powerful. Keep your guard up, we're here. Azoth shot back suddenly, the white-haired elf, unsheathing the first 2 inches of his blade as he did so, even as a ball of crackling lightning appeared in his offhand. Seeing this, Welf unsheathed his own sword, his mouth firming up into a thin line as he gripped the two-handed weapon tightly in front of him. Stepping through the entrance, the duo soon found themselves in a dark, stone-walled cavern, one which was currently lit by several merrily crackling torches that were bracketed on the walls. Not quite what I was expecting, Azoth said dryly, his lip quirking upwards even as his mage light dispersed into nothingness. Noticeably, Welf could see that the floor, like on floor 10, was covered in thick, swirling mist. From beside him, Welf remained tense, his eyes roving the area around him, just as he knew Azoth was probably doing beneath his relaxed facade. Ah, well, come on then, we'll have a look around. See what this floor is like, and then probably head back. We don't want to push it too far, eh? Azoth smiled, easily drawing his sword as he did so, even as he led the way through a nearby rocky passage. The two of them, easily able to walk side by side as they did so. It kind of looks like the 5th floor in its makeup, but with the mist from the 9th and 10th. Welf mused as he looked around in interest, his eyes flicking this way and that as the duo walked through the gradually widening passage, both of their weapons still at the ready, as they kept an eye out for any danger. Maybe these things all start to look the same to me after a while. Azoth replied easily, his gaze still surveying the area in front of them as the passage continued to widen. Openings, noticeably beginning to appear as they headed deeper into the floor, openings that branched off in multiple different directions. Some of the openings in the rocky walls spanning several meters in diameter, whilst others were little more than a foot or so wide. The number of openings growing with every step they took, until soon enough the two of them found themselves walking through a labyrinthine mess of tunnels and caverns, all of which were lit by luminescent fungus that grew on the walls, the light from the ensconced torches having long since disappeared as they walked deeper and deeper into the 11th floor. It's kind of eerie that we haven't come across anything yet, don't you think? Welf muttered to Azoth about 10 minutes later, as he looked around, his white-knuckled grip on his weapon as tight as ever, even as a single, solitary bead of sweat trailed down from his forehead. Oh, they are out there, Azoth replied softly, his grip on the hilt of his sword much lighter. The slight smile on his face somewhat putting Welf at ease as the other adventurer idly looked around, inspecting their surroundings with interest. They are following us and lurking in the shadows of those many tunnels, watching and waiting. Waiting for what? Welf asked nervously, turning to look at one of the many gloomy tunnels that surrounded them, only for him to flinch slightly as he saw a large shadowy shape shift backwards, deeper into one of the tunnels and away from the dim bluish light that lit up the area they were in. For us to venture into one of the tunnels so they can ambush us, or maybe for there to be enough of them to successfully surround and kill us. That or maybe they are just curious, and working out whether or not we're worth the effort of killing. Azoth shrugged as he said that, and came to a halt, his violet eyes boring into one of the larger tunnels, watching as a large dark shape shifted about deeper within the tunnel. Honestly, I'm not sure. I still haven't figured out whether or not some of the monsters have intelligence and sentient thought, or whether they are just driven by instinct and a kind of low cunning. Before Welf could reply to Azoth's odd musings, both he and the snow elf were interrupted by a sudden roar from one of the side tunnels, after which a massive shadow erupted from one of the larger passages and into the main one where they were stood. The shadow soon revealing itself to be a mass of white fur and muscle, two giant white-furred arms lunging forwards, even as a set of glistening teeth were bared. Almost immediately Welf reacted, giving ground as he backed off from the large silverback, one of the more dangerous monsters that dwelled on floor 11 and 12. The colossal mass of muscle would turn him into mincemeat if he allowed it to hit him. Silverbacks after all were very strong, and also pretty heavy. As he thought this, Welf saw Azoth do the opposite of him and lunge forward, his magical sword flying out of its sheath in a blur of golden metal, before, with just a single slash, the white-haired elf carved a deep slash into the monster's chest, drawing a shower of blood from it, even as he shifted to the side and darted back, allowing the creature's heavy mass to tumble past him. Raising his sword as the silverback hit the ground with an almost deafening bellow, Welf was just on the verge of rushing in to finish off the downed monster before it could get up, only for him to stop as, literal moments after Azoth delivered his slash and the monster hit the floor, fire erupted from its bloody wound, catching alight its thick fur as unnatural, fiery golden flames rapidly enveloped it, the fire burning with supernatural ferocity as it rapidly started to consume the fur and scorch the flesh beneath, burning the wound creature to death. In mere moments, even as Azoth continued forward, not even looking back. Welf, however, was still struggling to tear his gaze away from the now blessedly quiet and smoking corpse of the silverback, not noticing as he did the screeches coming from nearby passages as other monsters started to flood into the main cavern they were in. No, instead his gaze was on the dead monster in front of him, his throat beginning to constrict, as the stench of its burning flesh and fur filled his nose, even as the monster began to disintegrate into black dust. A single cut, and a non-fatal one at that, that was all it had taken to kill the beast. Seeing the deadly results of that single slash, Welf couldn't help but stare. He now desperately wanted to have a look at that magic sword, Dawnbreaker, that was what Azoth had called it. Welf, focus. Azoth called out, his movements swift and graceful as he practically danced through the swarm of monsters, never staying still for a moment as he moved with every slash, his blade a golden blur as he didn't waste a single movement, each one delivering fiery death to one of his foes. Oh yeah, right, sorry. Welf called back, cursing himself for getting distracted. This was the dungeon. Even a moment's distraction could spell death, especially for a tiring level 1 on the 11th floor. With that in mind, Welf ran forwards, his large blade swinging around to cleave an imp in 2, after which he lunged to the side to avoid a heavy swing from a club-wielding orc, with him responding in kind by lashing out with his sword, slashing the large monster's belly open, and then bringing it to the ground with another with slash to one of its tree trunk-like legs, and then finishing it off with a thrust through its throat. Nice, Azoth called out to him, the elf's hair not looking as white as it had before, as blood and gore spattered his face and hair, even as a manic smile spread across his face. His blade dealing fiery death with every slash, scaring the monsters around him and stopping them from massing up, even as his other hand unleashed explosive balls of fire every few seconds. The guy looked like a maniac, with burning creatures falling to the ground all around him, whilst other monsters tried in vain to flee from him, only to be blasted to pieces by his weak fire spell. The sickeningly sweet smell of melting, charred flesh, mingling with the stench of blood and burning fur, hair and who knows what else, even as Azoth continued his destructive rampage. The elf's actions pushing the monsters back and, Welf noticed, drawing their attention to Azoth and away from Welf, which in turn allowed him to skirt around the sides of the melee, cutting down several confused and scared monsters with relative ease. This was not a battle, it was a slaughter. Sometime later, sheathing his sword, Azoth spent a few moments surveying the decimated area around him. Sickly sweet-smelling smoke lingered in the air, mixing with the silvery mist that seemed to infest the labyrinth-like floor. On the floor he could see dozens upon dozens of monster soul gems littering the floor, along with the occasional drop item. The hide of orcs, the teeth of silverbacks, armored plates. From hard armors. There were dozens of trophies from the battle lying around. Already he could see Welf moving around collecting up the remnants of the monsters, whilst Azoth stayed on guard. Looking around the misty area, he made sure to keep his hand on his sword. His eyes narrowed as he looked into the different passages that led into the main chamber. A large ball of mage light now floating far above his head, with him constantly maintaining it as it shone. A silvery blue light all around, adding to the light from the glowing fungus on the walls. So what did you think of your first trip down to the 11th floor? Azoth asked idly, turning his gaze from his surroundings and instead to the red-headed smith as he did so. Active. Welf replied, pausing midway through bundling up a thick, furry white hide, his blue eyes flicking over to Azoth. There were a lot of monsters, too many for even a group of level 1s to handle. I mean, that fight just now. That was ridiculous. They weren't that tough. Azoth shrugged, a slight laugh leaving his lips as he looked around the cavern again. Maybe not for you, but for those of us who aren't level 6, they were. Welf replied dryly. Good point. Azoth acknowledged, his lip quirking upwards. He hadn't quite gotten used to this points and level system that was used here. Back in Tamriel they didn't have these levels or statuses, and very few people ever got blessings from divine beings, or at least permanent blessing. It was all still pretty alien to him. Welf smiled slightly at that and stood up straight. Before he could reply with the quip he had likely just thought up, however, both his and Azoth's attention was instead drawn to the other side of the cavern, to the largest tunnel that led deeper into the dungeon. Do you hear that? Welf whispered, dropping his bag of monster soul gems and materials to the floor, as he instead reached for his sword. Yes, Azoth replied, his expression more relaxed as he turned to face the commotion, though he did still draw his sword slightly, loosening it from its scabbard. Voices, him, and footsteps as well. My guess is another group of adventurers. Raising his head, Azoth sniffed the air as he said this, ignoring the foul stench of burnt monster flesh as he instead tried to use his heightened senses, courtesy of being a werewolf, to identify the newcomers. No, I'm pretty sure that they are not monsters. For one, they are talking, and for another, I think there are a lot of them walking this way too, and by the sounds of it, they have some wagons with them too. Azoth cocked an eyebrow at the last part, listening closely as he heard the voices becoming more distinct, though the rumble of wagons and was that the slight grumbling and growling of some kind of beasts were still distinguishable. In response, Welf shrugged, his expression nonplussed. Soon enough, however, their curiosity was answered as the golden light from a number of lanterns began to shine on the far wall, announcing the group's arrival, even as they exited the far tunnel and entered the cavern. Frowning for a moment, a slightly bemused expression soon crossed Azoth's face as he eyed the newcomers. There must have been about 30 of them all told, all of them armed with an assortment of weapons, and wearing a whole range of different types of armor. One thing the adventurers, for that was what they surely must be going off of their garb, and the fact that many of them looked human or elven, had in common though, was that they were all wearing red masks. Not just any masks though, but masks that looked like they had been designed to look like the head of a mammoth, complete with the trunk and the tusks. Stifling a snort of laughter, Azoth cast a sideways look at Welf. The Ganesha familiar. Welf said, rolling his eyes now, even as the convoy approached. The wagons they were pulling behind them in clear view now, revealing the large cages that sat on top of them, within which monsters could clearly be seen. Some of them recognizable, like the silverbacks and hard-armored, whilst others weren't so recognizable to Azoth, such as the giant boar-like monster, and the one that stood like a man but had fur and the head of a bull. There were likely even more caged monsters there that he didn't recognize, however many of the cages were covered up, or were boarded up with wood. Relaxing his grip on his sword slightly, Azoth moved to stand to one side, following Welf as the larger party continued on through the cavern. Hey there, fellow adventurers. One of the mammoth-masked men at the front of the column shouted to the two of them. The man in question, a thin individual with a green half-cloak and a simple short sword sheathed at his hip, stepping out of the convoy and approaching them as he did so. Looks like you've all had a time of it. What did you do? Fall into a monster pantry by accident? More like a monster ambush. Azoth shrugged, speaking up for the two of them as his Fellow Smiths seemed to have gone very silent, even as the convoy continued past them. Now, heading off in the direction of the upper floors. An ambush, EY. The man frowned. Well, sounds like you two were lucky to come out of that alive. The monsters lower down in the dungeon do tend to be a bit cannier than their brethren further up. You two must be pretty high level to have survived. Azoth shrugged at that, and instead just thrust his hand forward. The name's Azoth. Hephaestus familiar. The quiet one behind me is Welf, same familiar. Nice to meet you, I'm Kazuma, an executive in the Ganesha familiar. The brown-haired man smiled, taking Azoth's pale hand in his own. His grip noticeably strong, and his hands very calloused. Azoth nodded at that, his violet eyes flicking from Welf to the other adventurer. Curiosity welling up within him over the other smith's sudden silence, and the fact that Kazuma also seemed to ignore the redhead. So I have to ask, what are you doing? You know, transporting monsters up to the surface. Surely that's not allowed. Azoth asked easily, a relaxed smile on his face giving credence to his lackadaisical outward attitude. Even if inwardly he was tense and ready to spring into action. He still didn't know enough about this place, and he wasn't about to assume that all adventurers were decent, law-abiding people. After spending his formative years growing up in the Thieves' Guild in Riften and as an ex-bandit, he knew for a fact that a lot of people in the world tended to be somewhat rotten. True, unless you have a permit, of course. Kazuma grinned, completely unperturbed by the question, his green eyes flicking over to the wagons as they rolled past, before going back to Azoth. The Ganesha familiar specialize in taming monsters, and so we often head down here to collect new ones. This lot, though, is for the upcoming Monsterphilia festival. Monsterphilia? Azoth queried, his lip quirking upwards as he tested the odd-sounding word out. That sounds odd. Kazuma let loose a bark of laughter at that. Wow, you must be a newbie adventurer. The Monsterphilia event is a once-in-a-year thing where we, the Ganesha familiar that is, head into the dungeon and capture some monsters, and then show them off in the Colosseum, you know, the one up on the surface. It's a real spectacle, and you know, it shows off our skills to the masses, advertising our wares, so to speak. Hell, if you're interested, there are even some opportunity to try out your hand at taming, and in front of an entire crowd too. So it's a circus? Azoth asked, his expression still amused. Of sorts, Kazuma grinned. Anyway, time's a wasting, and I'm going to need to head off. It was nice meeting you, Azoth. Welf, stay safe down here, right? Floor 11 and below isn't for newbie adventurers, especially not for such a small group. As you've probably realized by now, it's dangerous down here. Right, I'll keep that in mind. Azoth nodded, watching as the brown-haired man sent the two of them one last grin and a wave before he then jogged back to where the rest of the convoy was just leaving the large cavern. Asshole. Welf muttered as Kazuma disappeared around the corner and out of sight. Once again leaving the duo alone, the redhead looking particularly pissed off now as he went back to collecting all the fallen monster drops. I'm guessing you know him? Azoth asked, helping Welf out now as he too began to collect up the fallen stones. Yeah, he's a level 5 adventurer with the Ganesha familiar, and a real arrogant bastard. He tried to get me to make a sword for him once, a magic one, and when I refused, well, he got pretty nasty about it and attempted to force me to. Fortunately, Tsubaki was around at the time and told him where to go, but still, he spread rumors after that, and, well, he's not a good person. Don't trust him, no matter how chummy he seems. Welf bit out, packing away the last of the stones in his bag before he stood up. Oh, don't worry, I had no intention of doing so. I've been an adventurer for a while now. Welf, maybe not in the dungeon or in Rio, but I've seen quite a few things, and met more than my share of scummy people. Azoth replied, patting Welf on the shoulder as he did so, before he headed off in the same direction the Ganesha familiar had gone, back to the surface. Are we heading back now? Welf asked. Yeah, I think I've seen enough for now. Plus we picked up enough soul gems and materials. For the moment. Azoth nodded, the mage light following him as he led the way back to the surface. Welf, now weighed down by a heavy bag, walking along behind him. That and I want to check out this Monsterphilia thing. It's overrated. Welf grunted. Maybe, but I'd like to check it out all the same. Azoth shot back, the two of them quickly, heading up through the dungeon and back to the surface. It had been a pretty successful trip. Into the dungeon today, all things considered. Chapter end notes. And so for those who like a bit of action, this was Azoth's first foray into the dungeon. Now though he is headed back to the surface to spend more time acclimatizing, meeting his fellow familiar members and of course checking out the local events like Monsterphilia. I'm sure nothing will go wrong with that. That said, I might also catch up with the gods and goddesses a bit, what with the banquet scene. Though whether I cover that fully and the changes Azoth's presence makes, or whether I just reference it, I'm not decided on yet. There are changes, some important, but at the same time, well, I'm not decided yet. I just know it needs to be covered in some way. That said, I think I will start working on updating one of my other stories first. Maybe the Last King, or potentially Oncoming Storm, or Atlas, or maybe even A Light in the Dark. Suffice to say, I haven't decided yet, and will instead, depending on my time, choose whatever interests me the most at the time of writing. Other than that, thanks a lot for reading, and I hope you enjoyed the chapter. A bit of convo between Azoth and Welf, some introspection on monsters, a bit of action and a meeting with another familiar. One which tends to be glossed over and treated as a running joke in canon. Thanks for reading, and I hope you review or that you at least enjoyed the update. Catch you later. Greed 720. The next part is on its way, so unless you want to be that one person who hears about it last, like and subscribe now to stay ahead of the game. Trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next. It's about to get epic. Thanks for listening. Catch you in the next chapter.